Hi YouTube, this is Joe Calton with Calton Cutlery. You can find me on the web, caltoncutlery.com. Okay, so we're still doing the video on the, or the series on making the new knife pattern, right? So yesterday I went ahead and I showed you how to fit up the handle scales, you know, on a full tang knife using a piece of wood that's a block, right? So this piece was you know, it's an inch thick, and it was, I don't know, probably 6 inches wide and 3 or 4 foot long when I bought it, right? Okay, so that's when you take a block of wood and turn it into scales, okay? So this is kind of just an addition to that, only what happens if you want to use sheet material, okay, like this micarta, micarta G10, you know, any of that stuff that comes in sheets like this. Okay, this stuff right here is 1/4 inch by 5 inch by 10 inch, which is a little on the thick side for a paring knife, but that's what I ordered. So, and it is straight up black paper micarta from Jantz, which is knifemaking.com there on the bottom, right? Okay, so there's a couple of differences in the order of operations when using sheet stock like this, right? Because it's, you know, we're certainly not going to split that in half, you know, to make 2 handle scales. All right, so what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to make one of those. So first things first, let's go over to the drill press. Oh, we're going to need our pins, you know, our 1/8 inch pins, and our scribe this time instead of a pencil. Okay, so here we are at the drill press. Let's kind of get you up in there just as close as we can. Actually, I'll just put you in front of me, and that way you'll be in between me and I'll just work around you. All right, and we got a clamp. Okay, so we'll go like this. Okay, so remember in the other video I told you you know, about using the 1, 2, 3 block, or it doesn't have to be a 1, 2, 3 block. I mean, you can use, you know, just a chunk of wood, but that's just to get the blade up, or the workpiece up off the table, so that your clamp doesn't, you know, bump into the table, right? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and remember to clamp this up so that if the drill bit ever grabs the blade and goes to spin it, okay, which this is going this way, okay, make sure that you situate the blade so that the spine of the blade is going to be coming into your hand instead of the edge of the blade, okay, because the spine will hurt an awful lot less. You know, I mean, even these things are dull. I mean, they'll still cut you. Oh. We got a number 30 drill bit in here, which is a point, or it cuts a .128 diameter hole. We're using 1/8 inch pins, which is a .125 diameter outside diameter pin stock. So we got 3/1000ths worth of wiggle room. These holes, when we made this, you know, when we drilled the holes prior to heat treat, we drilled all these holes with this number 30 drill bit. Okay, so let's go ahead and drill a couple holes. Once we got that back hole in place, we don't really need the clamp anymore, because as soon as that drill bit starts into that hole, it's going to make its own pin, okay? And this pin is in the back. So then there's not really much of any way that that blade can turn around unless it takes the whole sheet of micarta with it. Let's make sure that we're still lined up there in the back. Okay, so here's the part. One of the differences between, you know, the sheet stock, especially micarta, and wood, is that a pencil isn't going to mark this stuff. It's so slick that pencil lead, you know, you just can't see it. If it does mark it, you can't see it. So use a scribe. And like I said, these are these pinholes are 3/1000 of an inch oversized, okay? So you will have a little bit of slop, you know, in the blade moving back and forth after you put your 2 pins in. But honestly, it's not usually enough that the width of the scribe line won't cover it one way or another anyway. So, same way as on the other one, let's mark the top back here, like that. And then we'll mark this part right where we're going to want the scales to come out at. Pull our pins, and then we're going to attach those lines, or attach the marks. Okay, that gives us a rough indicator right there. Okay, now since we need 2 of these, we'll go ahead and clamp up and make another one. Okay, we got both our pinholes. Let's scribe it the same way as we did the first one. Okay, and then make our marks here. So we got one there. I'm still in focus. Okay. And one right there. We're going to pull our pins. Okay, so now we've got our 2 scales. The holes are drilled and the outlines are scribed in. Now we got to free these 2 from the rest of the block, or the rest of the sheet rather. Oh, and I still have this set up for splitting the other blocks. So let's just take it off. Get you up nice and tight there. I mean, not that this is really all that interesting. I mean, we're just cutting some handle scales out of a sheet of micarta. I should have just taken that right off the end. Okay, now since we got our scribed lines there, we can go ahead and kind of trim them and get them a little bit close. With micarta, the more you can do with a saw within reason, the more you can do with a saw so that the less you have to grind, the better. Because this stuff, you know, when you start grinding it, and the grinding dust is pretty rough on your lungs. Okay, so now we need the knife, and we'll go ahead and use these pins. Okay, let's go back over to the bench and get ready for our next step. Okay. Okay, so our next step here, like I said, on the the one with the block, we went ahead and ground this and shaped it and then smoothed it out first before we split the block. That way we know that, excuse my hands, it's kind of a cold day today, but it's not quite cold enough to light a fire. Maybe, I'm not really sure. We'll find out here in a little bit. But anyway, so this is a perfect match, you know, because we did this before we split it, right? Well, with this micarta, it's already split before, you know, we put it together. So the easiest way to do this is to take your pins well, didn't we drill that hole with that? Apparently that hole got a little bit of gunk in it, so let's just clean it out. That ought to do. Okay. Now we put our pins in. Now we put the other handle scale on so that we have both scales are pinned together. Now we lay our knife on top of that, and now since both of these scales are pinned together and there's only 3/1000ths worth of slop in the holes, that means that we can go ahead and shape this front edge here to where we want it to be on the knife. All right? So let's go back to the grinding room. Okay, now this right here, I mean, if I was doing, you know, this is a 36 grit belt. And I think in this batch of knives, I've only got 2 of them that have got micarta like this. So if I was going to be doing, you know, 5 or 10 of these, well, then I'd go ahead and I'd bring this down, because that isn't really a whole lot of material, especially for a 36 grit belt. I'd bring it down to like a 100 grit belt or something like that. But we're just doing a couple of these, and I got a fresh 220 over here, so so it'll work out all right. So we're going to see that our line right there and right there is pretty close to the plunge line where we're going to want it to be. And that's where our scribed line is, okay? So now we're going to rough it in. Okay, so that looks pretty dang close. There's going to be a flap. See this right here? That little flap of micarta that doesn't get ground. So there's that little flap right there. See, these knives are, I mean, this hadn't been sharpened yet. But they're still fairly sharp. I mean, all right. See how that is, you know, just a little bit below the plunge line there. And then if you kind of look down, let's see if I can get you right here, you can kind of see that I did a pretty good job matching up the plunge lines. Okay, so that means as long as those plunge lines are pretty close to each other, then that means that as long as we fit it up on one side, it's going to be pretty dang close on the other side. Okay, I mean, you can sit here and, you know, chase that kind of stuff for hours if you really want to, but, you know, these are using knives, so as long as you get them pretty close, well then, you know, that seems to work out all right. So now that was a 36 grit belt. Now, hope we're not getting a whole bunch of dust on the lens. Now we got that fairly fresh 220 that we used the other day, with, just has a little bit of cocobolo on it. So now let's go ahead, because that's way too coarse of a finish, I mean, even for me, on you know, on that portion of the knife. The reason that we go ahead and finish this portion of the knife now, or the scales now, is because once they're attached to the knife, you'll never be able to get in here and get this cleaned up as easily as you can now, okay? So right now, if you wanted to, I mean, I usually stop at a 220 grit belt finish on this, right? On a really nice knife, or, you know, something with like burl or something like that, you know, I might, you know, do the 220, and then I might take it over to the bench and then, you know, hand sand it down to like 600, and then, you know, I might take it and you know, just buff it on my jeans or something, you know, to brighten it up and make it look clean, okay? Once you have, I mean, if you can imagine this being on both sides, you know, because that's the way it's going to be. Once you have that on both sides, when you come in to try to clean this up, you know, let's say you take some sandpaper and you go like this, right? Well, that sandpaper is going to leave scratches on your blade. And then you come back and you try to finish your blade, and it's going to leave scratches on this, and you just chase your tail the whole dang time, right? So get this right here to your final finish before you do your glue up, all right? So let's go ahead and clean this up on the 220. A lot of times I like to do it, you know, to start cleaning it up on the platen, and then go to the slack belt, because the platen, it being a hard backing on the belt, you know, I mean, it's still a 220 grit finish, but it's a 220 grit finish with a hard backing versus a 220 grit finish with no backing, or, you know, the backing of the belt tension. And that softer support to the belt leaves a little bit finer of a finish. So does a, you know, a slightly worn belt also. Okay, it's going to get loud. Okay, I'm not sure if you noticed it, but when we, you know, I got the, you know, I ground on the platen, okay? Then I showed that to you, and there was a couple of like harder horizontal, or, you know, marks that went this way. And then I put it on the slack belt, and those went away, right? Now, like I said, if you want to clean it up some, you know, that puts a little bit of a shine on it. I mean, you can take that as high as you want to. I mean, I generally like a little bit coarser finish on handles, just because it seems like it's easier for me to grab a hold of them without a whole lot of contouring, because and that honestly comes down to preference for, you know, whoever's purchasing the knife, as well as preference on whoever's making the knife, right? Okay, so to make a handle that's got grip, you know, that sticks to your hand when you're using it, the two biggest ways to do that is, you know, through texture, all right? So whatever grit finish that you leave on the handle. So like if you take a 200 grit finish on a handle and a 1000 grit finish on a handle, obviously the 220 grit finish is going to be, it's going to stick in your hand a little bit better, right? Because it's coarser. There's more grippy there. And then the other way is to make it with more contouring, either contouring in the profile like this, so you got like a little hook here, okay? or profiling like this. So you'd have it thin in the mid, or the front, thin in the back, and then kind of thick in the middle. You know, that gives your hand, it fills your hand a little bit. I like fairly simple handle shapes, which means that I like a little bit coarser of a finish. A simpler handle shape is more comfortable for me in different positions. So, you know, if you were cutting on a board or you were peeling something, a simpler handle shape just feels a little bit better to me. Okay, so these two handle scales are still attached, and we've got this nice, you know, the front is faced off and everything. Okay. Now what we need to do is we need to be able to make sure that we know which is the outsides and which is the insides. So we probably should have done this on the belt grinder, but I'm not going to carry you back there. We've got our 80 grit sandpaper. Our 80 grit sandpaper on our granite tile here. So we're just going to do the same thing as we would on a belt grinder, and that's just take off these corners. Okay, so we rounded off that corner right there. Now let's round off the other one. Okay, now that side's rounded off. So now we know from now on what's outside and what's inside. So now we can go ahead and split these. Okay, and now, okay, first of all, when you order flat things from a supplier, go ahead and assume that they are not flat. Occasionally you'll get lucky and things will be flat, but if you assume that they're flat and they end up not being flat, then you'll end up having gaps where you shouldn't have gaps. But if you assume that things are not flat and you go ahead and you take steps to address that, or to at least check that, then your chances of having gaps later on down the road that you're not sure that where they came from are an awful lot less. Okay, so now these two pieces right here, this being micarta, not only have we not checked them for flat, but there's also burrs right here, okay, from cutting on the bandsaw. All right, and a little bit from the grinding, but not much. Now they're not big burrs, but they are big enough burrs that they can you know, kind of throw a monkey wrench into things. So we're going to hand sand these also. Okay, now here we don't have to do the pencil marks and we don't have to do the scribe lines because we got this nice glossy finish, and you can see what kind of finish the 80 grit sandpaper leaves. Okay, so as long as we hand sand this until the whole thing has got that matte finish, then we know that it's nice and flat, or at least as flat as we're going to get it in relation to the sandpaper and the granite tile. Okay, looks nice and even. Now we've also gotten these nice deep grooves in here from the 80 grit sandpaper for the epoxy to grab. So now we'll do the same thing on the other side. Okay, that looks pretty good. There's a little bit right up in here that has still got just a hair of the shine on it, whereas the rest of it is nice and matte, so we might give it another that much. Okay, now we should be able to look. I don't know if the camera's going to pick it up or not, but most of this dust is fairly uniform, right? But you'll be able to see there's some larger chunks in here, like there's a big one, that was part of that, that kind of a burr, if you will, that was left, kind of a burr or a you know, a ragged edge that was on the corners from the cut from the bandsaw. All right, so we got that done. So now our last check, our last couple of checks, is going to be to put the two handle scales together and look and see if there's any gaps. There's no gaps with just the handle scales. So now let's take our pins Okay, so everything's all pinned together. First, let's see if there's any gaps that we need to take a look at. You'd have gaps here if the tang wasn't mostly flat, okay, or if, you know, a stray hammer mark, you know, really put a divot in it, in the steel, you know, like a straightening mark or something. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now we want to look up in the ricasso area here and see that, first of all, that light behind the window is kind of tough to get used to there. Okay, so you got, that's where our plunge line is, right? So I want to make sure that the handle scale is below our plunge line on that side, and it's the same way on this side, and they look fairly even. All right, also check to make sure that there's no gaps up in there, okay, because sometimes when you're hand sanding, if you get off of the bevels and get up into the tang, you'll grind off a little bit more, even with 600 grit sandpaper, and make, you know, a big old gap right there. I mean, some gap, like I said, you've still got to have room for the epoxy, right? So there has to be epoxy in there, and the epoxy will fill small gaps, but you don't want there to be anything big and, you know, a big old honking gaping gap in there, right? Okay, so this particular knife handle now, let's get you back up over here. All right, so this knife handle right here is pretty much ready for the to do the glue up, right? Okay, so my next step, you know, in making this one, because this is the one that the video is all about, is I'm going to go ahead and catch up the rest of these to where they're at this point, okay? Because if you're going to mix epoxy, why mix epoxy for one knife? You know, when you can mix epoxy for 6 or 10 knives, you know, I mean, you're still mixing the epoxy, it's just a little bit more, right? And so the next time we meet, I'll have this all laid out, all these scales will be done, and they'll be on like newspaper and everything, all lined up and ready to start our final finish on the blades. Etching my mark, etching the blades to bring out the hardening line, and that's going to be some pretty exciting stuff. So, yeah, so that was just kind of a little bonus. This a different way to make handle scales. Either, you know, the original one was from a block, and then this one is from sheet material, whether it's micarta, G10, or, you know, whatever else there is out there that you'd like to work in that comes in sheet material. So again, this is Joe Calton with Calton Cutlery. You can find me on the web, caltoncutlery.com. Hope you enjoyed the video, and we will see you next time.